Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Directions Mag Geospatial webinar. I am Barbary Duke, Managing Editor here at Directions Mag, joined by our webinar producer, Lynette Qualia. We encourage you to stop by directionsmag.com for more news, articles, podcasts, and webinars. So we are excited to have Steve from Widgets, along with his guests, Katie and Andrew from Anne Arundel County, Maryland. They have an amazing presentation for you today, really getting into the nuts and bolts of how they are making this great solution work in their area. So welcome to the team. And without further ado, over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks very much, Barbary. So good morning and good afternoon, wherever you may be joining us from today. My name is Steve Madison, and I'm an account manager with Widgets. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speakers for today's webinar. They are the OIT GIS team at Anne Arundel County from the great state of Maryland. Here at Widgets, we've watched and supported the county for a number of years now as they've built out their web mapping applications. And quite honestly, I think it's safe to say that their work with WebGIS is excellent. We receive lots of inquiries from folks all over Canada and the United States asking about their applications. So we're very thrilled that they've agreed to share their work with us today. So with that, we'll turn it over to Anne Arundel County.
Thank you, guys. As already stated, we're Anne Arundel County, and we're going to be talking to y'all about our MyAnneArundel viewer. So just a quick little agenda. We're going to do a quick little about us just in case you're not familiar with where Anne Arundel is. We're going to talk about the MyAnneArundel public-facing application, and then we're going to go into the Widgets web and workflows that support that application. And then we're going to wrap up with our road ahead, if you will, where we plan on going in the future. And then we're going to take some questions. So about us, we are just shy of 600,000 citizens. We are a very interesting kind of setup because we're a major corridor for several cities such as Baltimore and Washington, D.C. Additionally, we have Baltimore Washington International Airport, we have Fort Meade, NSA, the U.S. Naval Academy, and the Chesapeake Bay within our jurisdiction. So we have this unique mixture of rural and urban. And as far as our GIS footprint goes, we are on ArcGIS Online. We have an enterprise set up in 10.9.1 in Amazon Web Services. We have about 1,600 internal users, and those internal users are in both a production portal and a stage portal. We have two Esri portals set up. So we've been using these products for over 10 years, starting way back with Essentials. We originally had an on-premise install, and we were using Geocortex Essentials and HTML5 viewer for our internal and our external applications. And those were both supported by the Series 4 workflow, print, and reporting add-ons. And then in September 2019, we decided to make the move to AWS, Amazon Web Services, for our GIS infrastructure for multiple reasons. So we installed the 5 series, and then we migrated the existing Geocortex Essential applications over. So we had to convert our workflow, printing, and reporting to 5. And then we started the end-of-life process for our public HTML5 viewer application. In December of 2019, that was when we ultimately decided that we needed to move to Widgets Studio Web for our external application. Following the 5.3 update with the VS Web Designer being improved, it was just the right time for us to go. And at that time, we started making a few one-off applications that were published with VS Web. And that ultimately leads us into our main topic today, the MyAnneArundel viewer. So just a quick overview. This is kind of our one-stop application for all of our GIS data for our citizens. So they have full access to our open data GIS library. And it also comes along with some useful lookups, tools, and reports. During our move to the Amazon Web Services, we did kind of take stock of all of our products that were available publicly. And by doing so, we noticed a few pitfalls, that we had multiple one-function applications kind of out and about. They didn't have a consistent look or feel. They had different base maps, different layer naming. They also weren't ADA compliant. And then we decided to do an overview of our ArcGIS Online and our portal inventories, and we noticed that we had a lot of different publishers. Nothing was really published under one main username, so you didn't really know who the authoritative source was. So by making this shift, we were able to identify all of these, not issues, but things we would like to improve. And those solutions kind of came through with that switch to Vertigis Web. So in Vertigis Web, ADA compliance and multilingual opportunities are just a little bit easier to implement than, say, with Essentials in the past. It provided a consistent look and feel as far as the user's experience and as far as the interface goes. And then because we had one master application, we were able to condense features and then kind of serve them out as different flavors of the app. So you'll see at the bottom, we have 5 different examples of what used to be one-off applications that are now all based off of the MyAnneArundel viewer. But because we're slicing a little piece out and filtering out anything that's not related to it, it does feel like we have one specific application available, and we can embed that on different web pages. So ultimately, we're getting the user to the information they need quickly and efficiently without having them feel like they have to go to 5 different places to get it. And by making this shift, we were able to publish under one custodian. So now when users look at our product, they'll see the same consistent username as the owner of that content. So the setup, it's all managed by OITGIS, but all of the data that is fueling this application is supplied by different departments. We get a notification from those users with a simple survey 123 form, letting us know when updates are needed. We prefer, when we do updates, to do a append and truncate. This typically is our go-to because it avoids configuration issues. The way Vertigis Studio Web is set up, if the schema changes, it could ultimately change how the workflow is going to digest that information. So by forcing an append and truncate, it's going to let us know ahead of time, like, hey, this field doesn't match this one, and avoid all those kind of issues and allow it to be streamlined. This application offers a variety of functionality. So your typical drawing, measure, and printing. We have made available a find property information workflow that calls on to reporting. So our citizens in that bottom right image can get a report they can print out of their property. We have oblique imagery, as well as a capital improvements project workflow. We've really taken some time to customize it out and make it as easy as possible for our users. And now I'm going to hand it over to Andrew. He's going to talk to you guys about VS Web and workflows.
All right, so I'm going to take a deeper dive into how we kind of decided and how we generally moved to web, and also how workflows integrate into our web mapping applications, and more specifically in our MyAnneArundel application. All right, so I'm sure others are throwing around the same idea, but the biggest thing for us was, or the biggest question we had to ask ourselves was, when was the right time to move? It was very apparent that web was the way forward for WebGIS, and it also kind of fell in line. Our move kind of also fell in line with Esri's 4x API map move and getting away from the 3x API applications. But the biggest sticking point to answer that question was, or has been, is there feature parity between Essentials and web? And from the time we moved to AWS, at the time there wasn't. Katie briefly touched on it, but when we moved, I believe the designer interface was still locked down. You had to modify the designer interface through the XML files and all that kind of stuff. So it wasn't ready for us then. And in early 2020, we kind of came to the conclusion that for our public viewer, feature parity was there, And then more recently, in the past few months, we came to that same conclusion for our internal Geocortex or Vertigis application. And that's the workhorse for the county. And that required higher feature parity, so it took a little longer to get there. But I kind of said that feature parity was good enough, and what I mean by that is that if a feature is missing, you more than likely can build it with a workflow. If you can't build it with a workflow, you can build it with either the web or workflow SDK, or at the very end, Vertigis is probably also working on that feature, and CAM's feature matrix has been a super helpful tool. If anybody's not aware of that, check out that link, but it tells you if feature X is available in Essentials and it's available in web. So to touch on the Web SDK, so this is where we develop custom components for our web applications. You develop them locally in a development environment, and you build out a library which you can then upload to your web application. So touching back to feature parity between Essentials and web, two of the biggest missing features we found were our Google Street View viewer that we had in Essentials, and also our pictometry viewer for Essentials. So they weren't in web, so we built it with the SDK, and the Eagle View one taps into Eagle View's API to bring in oblique and historic imagery into our viewer, whereas Google Street View uses Google's JS libraries to bring in Street View to our application. So another thing you can do with the Web SDK is bring in Esri widgets. To me, this is more of a low-hanging fruit one because they are fairly easy to add to your applications, and while they might not be included in web, you can bring in any Esri widget into your application as long as it's dependent on what version of web you have installed. So if your web install is using Esri's 4.20 JS API, make sure you're looking at widgets for the 4.20 API, things like that. And as some examples we brought in were elevation profile and some 3D measurement tools, and the daylight one in the bottom right, which is kind of cool. So if you're not comfortable with getting in into the Web SDK, I found this out recently, but Vertigis offers their incubator library on the Vertigis community page, where you can download precompiled SDK libraries that you can load into your application. So you could go grab an elevation profile. I think the sun widget is also over there. I think time sliders are in there too, but you don't have to develop the code if you don't want to. Vertigis is offering the incubator libraries for you to download from, which is a pretty cool feature. All right, so now my favorite, this is workflow. In essence, they literally do everything in our applications, and I can't emphasize that enough. I'm sure most of you are aware of use a workflow to fill out an take user input, fill out an autocomplete, query a layer, and return results. That's all well and good and gets the job done for most things, but I can't emphasize enough how much workflows are more than just that. We use them to integrate other APIs so we can make a REST call out to another enterprise system, bring back information from that system into our web applications. We use them for email sending with a Survey 123 webhook. That's a workflow for us. One big thing we do in MyAnneArundel, though, is we use workflows heavily in the app setup and just general functions of the application. So I'll touch on that in a couple of slides and show an example. But it's not really a GIS need for a workflow. It's more of like a web need for the workflow. But just the idea that the workflows are not just used for doing GIS things is my point. Then over on the other side, I want to touch on how I think workflow is less code is good in general. I'm a developer, I like to write code, but if I think about it, less code is always good. And with workflow, I can spend more time building and less time writing. I can use the pre-compiled workflow components to do different tasks without having to sit there and set up a development environment and to make sure everybody's set up in Bitbucket and make sure that all my libraries are all set in stone. I can just build with workflow. And while I say all that, workflow also allows me to go off the deep end and go build out advanced configurations with the workflow SDK. So I can always bring in custom code and go down that route if I need to. But for the most part, we're about like 90% vanilla workflow use, and probably about 10% of our components in workflow are custom components that we use. So for the most part, you can get a lot done with the vanilla version of workflow. But if you need to expand on it, you have the capabilities to with the Web SDK or the workflow SDK, and that has been very helpful. So workflows in the context of MyAnneArundel, one big design principle we followed when building workflows for MyAnneArundel was that they need to be modular. And what I mean by that is a workflow, everybody's thought of a workflow to me as a form to take user input. Again, that gets the job done, but I would like our workflows to be able to run from multiple locations. So the same workflow that takes in user input from a form can also be ran from a right click on the map, from the map context menu. It can be ran from a feature list or a result list. They need to be ran from multiple locations. It's less workflows for us to handle, and it makes more sense to do that. It's a lower or less code base to maintain. And the way we do that in almost every single one of our workflows, we have a value in there called workflow context. That is a JSON that's filled with any information that the workflow needs to run its business logic. So in that bottom right graphic, we can take input from multiple locations, process that input down into a singular workflow context. Then we can send that workflow context down to the business logic to accomplish the goal. So it makes plug and play workflows very easy in our applications. And as an example of that, in our MyAnneArundel app JSON, there's over 70 different workflow objects scattered throughout the application. But in reality, we're only using around, I think the number is actually 25, but around 25 to 30 individual workflows in the application. So I don't have over 70 workflows doing different things. I only have like 25 of them. And that allows us to make a workflow once, and I can add it to the I want to menu, or I could add it to the map context menu. I can add it anywhere in the application. And to just touch on a couple more things with the workflows in MyAnneArundel, it was critical for us to figure out the web commands in workflow, and the major one being results to and from graphics, converting features between web features and workflow features to be able to handle different things there. And then also hooking up workflows to web events. Any event in your web apps configuration can be a workflow being run, and having that light bulb trip off for me was very critical in having success with these applications. And I'll show an example. This next slide is an example of a web event and how we handle workflows. So this, again, a web event and our workflow. So the application has a few different phases. As it loads out, you got your app initialization phase, and then you also have your map initialization phase. We run two workflows during those phases that more or less, Katie touched on it earlier, but we can serve out different flavors of the application. This is the pipes, the underlying nuts and bolts of how that works. But we run one workflow on the left in the app initialization. We check a bunch of URL parameters. We decide if we need to load out our mobile format or our desktop format, or if we need to load out our embed or embed side format. Then we pass those parameters over into the map initialization phase, where we loop over the map, make sure some layers are turned on and off just to do a few checks there. And then we process what URL parameters were captured in app init. We process over in map init, and then decide, do we need to run a workflow? Do we need to run out? Do we need to load in default mode, or do we need to load our oblique imagery? Things like that. And if anybody wants to go into more detail on this slide, it's a little overwhelming, feel free to email us. And finally, to touch on workflow SDK, it follows the same concept of the Web SDK, but if something is missing, you can build it, and you have the workflow SDK to do that. We use both custom form elements and custom activities with the workflow SDK. Our custom activities range from, they're over there on the left, but from parse URL better, grab URL parameters from the URL, or we can redirect users to another URL, a bunch of like helper functions that kind of get used under the hood to reach an end goal. Whereas our custom form elements may be inputs that we would like to have in workflow that weren't available at the time. So a color picker, a nicer number slider, we can tap into our CCTV camera system and play videos from that system in our viewers now. And one of the bigger ones we kind of just deployed actually was our the layerless filter we built out with the workflow SDK. So that's missing from web, and where you're able to build that out with the workflow SDK. And that's actually in the pipeline for web. So if anybody's thinking about building that, maybe hold off. You can go to the next one, Katie, or actually, I think you pick up now.
Yeah, so I'll pick up here. We're going to just do a quick little road ahead where we're going with our future projects. So we mentioned the internal viewer very briefly. Right now it's residing in Essentials, and we are starting the migration process for that viewer to come into Widgets Studio Web. So currently that internal viewer is getting roughly 300 sessions per day, and that's primarily internally on desktop. So we're planning for that migration to web to be sometime in the first week of July. What that's going to entail is some large-scale testing of the applications. We are currently having several contractors compare functionality between the new and old versions, and then we're going to kind of do a soft opening with our power users. They're going to come in and test our existing workflows, and then we're also going to let them test their normal day operations within the application to give us some feedback on how it feels, how big of a shift it is, so we have an idea of what we need to do for training. We're also porting workflows from Geocortex Essentials over to Widgets Studio Web. So how we get layers, how we show layers, and how we query layers in the workflow is changing. And once both applications are up and running, we're going to have the Essentials one available for a short period of time before we're going to automatically redirect users over to Widgets Studio Web. That way they can have a little bit of a learning period and then get comfortable with the application before they're thrown into the deep end, if you will. So additional future projects, we're going to be looking at implementing 3D in both the external and internal viewers. So we have a county-wide level of detail to buildings layer and our near map mesh captures that you can see in the animation next to this text. We want to get that into these applications and be available. We're also looking at adding the layer comparison functionality to both internal and external, so users can compare two different layers in the same web extent. And lastly, we are going to coordinate with some contractors about integrating Viewworks and Estella into our Widgets GIS Studio Web. So it's going to need some custom workflows to have some functionality, because right now it's not out of the box from these systems. So we're going to be building those out and working on it. And that brings us to questions. So I'm going to look at the chat.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Wow, such great information. And we have a huge compliment for your team. Someone says that they always use MyAnneArundel as an example for anyone who is curious about what Widgets Studio can do. So congrats. That's great. So question number 1 for the team. How was the transition from Geocortex HTML viewer to web? And how do you authenticate users for your internal apps?
I could touch on the authentication.
Okay.
So our post installer for web is hooked up to our enterprise. So we use portal authentication, and our users authenticate with our portal. As the move from Essentials to web, we've done it with our public viewer. That one pretty smooth. The biggest move is our internal viewer, which we're currently in the process of doing right now, and it's going smooth now. The real test of that comes to when the users start testing. So I can get back to you on that, but we should be good. The feature parity is there, and again, if something's missing, we can always build it.
Excellent. Question for Steve. If folks want to get more details or see what's possible, do you have a good place for them to reach out?
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to go over to our our website, obviously there's a lot of good product information there. You can also launch a trial of the software. So worth noting that Vertigus Studio is now SaaS enabled. So, if you want to mess around with some workflows, maybe take the reporting component for a test drive, you just simply go to vertigus.com and you can trial the software there. You can author these reports, author these workflows. You can have them run within your web app builder applications, or you could even trial the see, I do it myself, the Vertigus Studio web viewer.
Excellent. All right. Another question coming in for the team. Are there any challenges or limitations you came across with Vertigus? Also, is it the Vertigus EXP builder compatible?
Yes, Vertigus Studio is compatible with Experience Builder, as well as Web App Builder for ArcGIS. So the overarching objective here with the software is to develop it in such a way so as to provide GIS users out there with numerous options for building the right kinds of applications for the job. So if you're authoring applications using Experience Builder, and as I say, if you need to add a workflow or you want to provide some advanced reporting capabilities to that application, there is that compatibility.
Great. Thanks again to Steve, Katie, Andrew for sharing their expertise, and also a shout out to Brock and Matt who are helping out with some logistics and things on the back end as well. We hope that you will have a great day. Tell a friend about Vertigus and Directions Magazine. Thanks, everybody.